The year was 2003, and Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood before a review board of stone-faced military officers, their polished metals catching the harsh fluorescent light. Her hands remained steady despite the tremor in her voice as she defended her application for explosive ordnance disposal training. "With all due respect, Lieutenant," the colonel at the center of the table said, his weathered face betraying decades of battlefield experience, "bomb disposal requires nerves of steel. Women are simply too emotional for this kind of work. One moment of panic, one tear, and you're not just dead, you've taken your entire team with you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She had heard variations of this argument throughout her military career, from basic training to her current position as a communications officer. The assumption that her gender made her inherently unstable, unreliable, unfit for the most dangerous roles in the armed forces. But what these men didn't know was that Sarah Chen had been defusing explosive situations her entire life. Born in a small town in Ohio, to immigrant parents who had fled the chaos of war-torn Southeast Asia, Sarah learned early that survival often meant thinking 3 steps ahead while everyone else was still processing step 1. Her father, a former engineer turned factory worker, would spend evenings teaching her about circuits and electrical systems, his weathered hands guiding hers as they rebuilt radios and small appliances. "Patience, little one," he would say in his accented English. "Every wire has a purpose. Every connection matters. Rush and you destroy everything." Her mother, meanwhile, had survived the real-world equivalent of what Sarah now sought to do professionally. During the final days of Saigon, she had navigated through minefields and unexploded ordnance to reach safety, carrying Sarah's older brother on her back while pregnant with Sarah herself. The stories her mother told weren't of heroic deeds or military glory. They were of quiet determination, of making impossible decisions under unthinkable pressure, of the kind of emotional strength that masquerades as fragility to those who have never truly been tested. Sarah excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and physics, but her true calling became clear during a high school science fair. She had built a complex demonstration showing how different types of explosives worked, complete with safe, controlled detonations that illustrated the principles of pressure waves and chemical reactions. Her chemistry teacher, a former Navy demolitions expert, pulled her aside afterward. "You have an intuitive understanding of this stuff that I've only seen in the best EOD techs I worked with," he told her. "Have you ever considered the military?" That conversation planted a seed that grew throughout her college years. While studying electrical engineering, Sarah joined ROTC, where she consistently outperformed her male counterparts in everything from physical fitness to tactical planning. She could field strip and reassemble weapons faster than anyone in her unit, and her scores on technical aptitude tests were consistently in the top percentile. But when it came time for job assignments, she was repeatedly steered toward appropriate roles, communications, logistics, administration. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same emotional intelligence that supposedly made her unfit for combat was exactly what made her exceptional at reading people, understanding their motivations, and predicting their actions. In training exercises, she could anticipate enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, not through some mystical feminine intuition, but through careful observation of patterns and behavioral cues that her male colleagues often missed. When she finally got her chance to apply for EOD training, Sarah had already spent 2 years in the Army, watching from the sidelines as less qualified candidates were fast-tracked into the specialized roles she desperately wanted. She had studied every manual, watched every training video, and even learned from retired EOD specialists during her off-duty hours. She knew more about explosive devices than some active-duty bomb technicians, but none of that mattered if she couldn't convince this review board to give her a chance. "Colonel," she said, her voice gaining strength, "emotional regulation isn't about the absence of emotion. It's about the intelligent management of it. Fear keeps you alive in this job. Empathy helps you understand the bomber's mindset. Compassion motivates you to work harder when lives are on the line. These aren't weaknesses, they're tactical advantages." The room fell silent. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. To his left, a younger major shuffled through her file, noting her test scores and performance reviews. To his right, a grizzled sergeant major who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts nodded almost imperceptibly. "You realize," the colonel continued, "that if we approve this, you'll be entering a program with a 40% washout rate. You'll be training alongside men who have been preparing for this their entire military careers. The physical demands alone—" "Sarah," Sarah interrupted, then immediately caught herself. "With permission to speak freely, sir. I've been preparing for this my entire life. Not just my military career, my entire life. And I'm not asking for special treatment or lowered standards. I'm asking for the same opportunity to fail or succeed that you've given to every other qualified candidate." The EOD training facility at Eglin Air Force Base was a sprawling complex of bunkers, training ranges, and specialized laboratories where the most dangerous skills in the military were taught and perfected. Sarah arrived on a humid Florida morning, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror. She was one of 24 candidates beginning the 18-week course that would either transform her into one of the military's most elite specialists or send her packing back to her previous assignment with her tail between her legs. The instructors made it clear from day one that they had not wanted her there. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with burn scars running up his left arm and a reputation for being harder on students than a diamond-tipped drill bit, singled her out immediately. "Chun," he barked during their first formation, "I want you to understand something. This isn't about gender equality or breaking barriers. This is about life and death. When your classmates wash out, and they will wash out, it'll be because they couldn't handle the pressure. When you wash out, it'll be because I can't risk the lives of real soldiers on some social experiment." Sarah bit her tongue and focused. Straight ahead. She had expected this kind of resistance, had prepared for it mentally during the months leading up to her acceptance into the program. What she hadn't anticipated was how the hostility would manifest in countless small ways throughout each day. Her equipment would mysteriously malfunction. Her study notes would disappear. Her bunk would be short-sheeted or filled with shaving cream. The other candidates, taking their cue from the instructors, treated her with a mixture of awkward chivalry and outright disdain, but Sarah had learned long ago that the best response to doubt was competence. While her classmates spent their evenings complaining about the impossible demands of the course, or trying to unwind with video games and beer, she studied. She memorized the technical specifications of every known explosive device, studied the psychological profiles of different types of bomb makers, and practiced her hand coordination exercises until her fingers moved with surgical precision. Coursework was divided into 3 main phases: academic instruction, hands-on technical training, and field exercises. The academic phase covered everything from basic chemistry to advanced electronics, from terrorism tactics to post-blast forensic analysis. Sarah excelled here, her engineering background giving her a significant advantage over classmates who struggled with the complex mathematical concepts underlying explosive physics. It was during the hands-on training that her true talents began to emerge. Working with live explosives required a unique combination of technical knowledge, manual dexterity, and psychological composure that couldn't be taught. It had to be innate. Sarah discovered that she possessed what her civilian father had tried to teach her years earlier: the ability to see systems holistically, to understand how each component related to every other component, and to remain calm under pressure that would paralyze most people. Her first real test came during week 6, when students were required to disarm increasingly complex improvised explosive devices in simulated combat conditions. The scenario was straightforward. A car bomb had been discovered in a populated area, and civilians were trapped nearby. The device was designed to explode if moved, if the wrong wire was cut, or if too much time elapsed. Sarah approached the mock-up vehicle while her classmates watched from a safe distance, her hands steady despite the artificial fog machines and sound effects designed to simulate battlefield chaos. The device was more sophisticated than anything they had encountered in previous exercises. Multiple redundant triggers, decoy wires, and a timer that seemed to be counting down faster than expected. Sarah spent the first precious minutes simply observing, studying the bomber's handiwork like an art critic examining a painting. She could see the logic behind each component, the psychology of the person who had assembled it. This wasn't random, it was personal. The bomber wanted credit for their work, wanted the disposal technician to appreciate their cleverness, even as they tried to defeat it. Working methodically, Sarah began to isolate different systems within the device. She identified the primary trigger mechanism, then the backup to the backup. Each decision was made with deliberate precision, her training overriding the natural human instinct to rush when death seemed imminent. Her classmates later said they could see her lips moving slightly as she worked. Though she seemed unaware of it, she was talking herself through each step, maintaining verbal connection to her own thought processes to prevent panic from overwhelming. Logic. With less than 2 minutes remaining on the timer, Sarah made her final cut. The device went silent, the red LED display freezing at 37 seconds. The exercise was over. She had succeeded where 12 of her 23 remaining classmates had failed the same scenario over the previous 2 days. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez walked over to examine her work, his expression unreadable. He studied the disabled device for several long minutes, checking each cut wire and disconnected component. Finally, he looked up at Sarah, who was standing at attention and trying not to show how badly her hands were now shaking in the aftermath of the exercise. "That was textbook perfect," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual edge. "But textbook perfect doesn't mean much if you can't do it when people are shooting at you, and your radio is full of static and you haven't slept in 36 hours. He paused, studying her face. "We'll see what you're really made of when we get to the field." Exercises. Week 12 brought the candidates to the most challenging phase of their training. Live-fire field exercises conducted in conditions designed to simulate actual combat deployment. The training area resembled a war zone, complete with damaged buildings, improvised barriers, and the constant sound of simulated gunfire and explosions in the distance. This was where psychological pressure met physical exhaustion, where months of classroom learning would either crystallize into real-world capability or crumble under the weight of authentic stress. That Sarah had made it further than anyone had expected, including herself. Of the original 24 candidates, only 11 remained. 3 had washed out during the academic phase, unable to master the complex technical requirements. 6 more had been eliminated during hands-on training, their nerve failing when faced with live explosives. 4 others had been removed for various reasons: injuries, psychological unsuitability, or simply the recognition that they weren't cut out for this specialized role. The remaining candidates had formed an uneasy camaraderie over the previous months. The initial hostility toward Sarah had gradually transformed into grudging respect, as she consistently outperformed expectations. Marcus Thompson, a former infantry sergeant from Georgia, had become her unofficial study partner after she helped him through a particularly difficult lesson on electronic timing devices. James Park, a soft-spoken specialist from California, often sought her advice on technical problems that seemed to baffle him. Despite his strong academic background, but respect among peers meant nothing if she couldn't prove herself to the instructors, who would ultimately determine her fate. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez remained her harshest critic, though his criticism had evolved from personal attacks to professional challenges that pushed her to perform at levels she hadn't known she possessed. Master Sergeant Williams, the senior instructor who had final authority over all candidates, had maintained a carefully neutral stance throughout the training, observing Sarah's progress without offering either encouragement or discouragement. Field exercise that would define Sarah's future began at 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning when candidates were roused from their bunks and given a mission briefing that was deliberately incomplete and contradictory. Intelligence reports suggested that a terrorist cell had planted multiple explosive devices throughout a mock village, but the details were fragmentary and unreliable. Civilians were allegedly trapped in the area, but their exact locations were unknown. Time was critical, but rushing would be fatal. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Alpha, working alongside Thompson and Park under the supervision of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Their objective was to clear a 3-story building that intelligence suggested contained both hostages and explosive devices. The building's layout was unfamiliar, the lighting was poor, and background noise from other training exercises made communication difficult. As they approached the target building, Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She began cataloging potential threats, analyzing sightlines, and considering the psychological profile of their theoretical adversary. The building showed signs of recent occupation: scattered papers, overturned furniture, and most ominously, electrical wires that seemed to serve no legitimate purpose snaking along the baseboards and up the walls. Rodriguez positioned himself at the building's entrance while the 3 candidates began their systematic search. The first floor appeared clear, but Sarah noticed irregularities in the electrical system that suggested modification. On the second floor, Park discovered what appeared to be a pressure-sensitive device attached to a door, leading to a room where mannequins represented civilian hostages. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for throughout months of training. The device was sophisticated, clearly designed to test everything they had learned about both technical skills and decision-making under pressure. Multiple wires of different colors connected various components in a pattern that seemed almost deliberately confusing. A digital timer displayed 38 minutes and counting downward, but Sarah suspected this was primarily psychological pressure. Real bomb makers rarely advertised their intentions so clearly, working by flashlight. While Thompson provided security and Park monitored for additional threats, Sarah began her systematic analysis of the device. She photographed it from multiple angles, sketched the wire configuration in her notebook, and began the delicate process of tracing each electrical pathway to understand the bomber's logic. The device incorporated several techniques they had studied in previous weeks: a primary trigger that would activate if the door was opened, a secondary system that would respond to vibration or movement, and what appeared to be a timer backup that would ensure detonation regardless of other factors. But as Sarah studied the construction more carefully, she began to see something that her classmates had missed in similar scenarios. This wasn't just a test of technical knowledge, it was a test of psychological insight. The bomber, she realized, had built their device not just to kill, but to challenge the disposal technician. Hidden among the functional components were several red herrings: wires that led nowhere, components that served no purpose except to confuse and intimidate. The real key to disarming the device lay not in cutting the right wire, but in understanding which components could safely be ignored. With Rodriguez watching silently from the doorway, Sarah began her work. Her hands moved with the steady precision that had become her trademark, each decision made with deliberate care but without hesitation. She isolated the primary trigger mechanism, disabled the vibration sensor, and then faced the final challenge. A series of wires that seemed to offer multiple solutions, each potentially correct, each potentially fatal if she had misread the bomber's intentions. 23 minutes remained on the timer when Sarah made her final cut. The device went silent, the timer display going dark. The exercise was complete, the theoretical hostages saved, and Sarah Chen had proven that she belonged among the military's most elite specialists. Graduation from EOD school came with little fanfare, but enormous significance. Sarah Chen stood among the 7 candidates who had survived the 18-week crucible, receiving her certification as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist with the same quiet pride that had carried her through months of doubt and challenge. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been her harshest critic, pulled her aside after the ceremony. "Chen," he said, his scarred face showing an expression she had never seen before, something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply acknowledgement. "I want you to know that I tried to break you because I've seen what happens when EOD techs aren't ready for what they'll face downrange. I've lost good soldiers because they weren't prepared for the psychological pressure." He paused, looking out at the training facility where they had spent so many grueling months. "You're ready. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah's first assignment took her to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. The transition from student to operational specialist was jarring. Suddenly she was responsible not just for her own performance, but for the lives of soldiers who depended on her expertise. Her unit, the 184th Ordnance Battalion, was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, where improvised explosive devices had become the enemy's weapon of choice against coalition forces. The reality of EOD work was different from training in ways both subtle and profound. In school, every scenario had been carefully controlled, with instructors monitoring every decision and safety protocols, ensuring that mistakes resulted in academic failure rather than death. In the operational military, Sarah quickly learned that the margin for error was exactly 0, and the consequences of miscalculation were measured in body bags rather than failing grades. Her team leader was Chief Warrant Officer Michael Santos, a 15-year veteran who had deployed to Iraq 3 times and Afghanistan twice. Santos had initially been skeptical about working with someone he privately referred to as the diversity hire, but Sarah's technical competence quickly won him over. More importantly, she demonstrated something that couldn't be taught in any school: the ability to remain calm and analytical when everything around her was falling apart. Their first major operation together came during a pre-deployment exercise at the National Training Center in California. The scenario involved a complex urban warfare simulation where Sarah's team was tasked with clearing explosive devices from a mock Afghan village while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise was designed to be as realistic as possible, complete with role-playing civilians, blank ammunition, and pyrotechnics that created genuine chaos and confusion. Sarah found herself working on a suspected vehicle-borne improvised explosive device while gunfire crackled around her position. The simulation was so realistic that her body responded as if the danger were genuine: elevated heart rate, heightened sensory awareness, and the peculiar time distortion that combat veterans describe when split-second decisions determine life and death outcomes. The device hidden in the mock Taliban truck was more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in training. It incorporated cell phone triggers, backup timing mechanisms, and what appeared to be anti-handling devices designed to kill anyone who attempted to disarm it. Working by flashlight while wearing full protective gear, Sarah had to diagnose and defeat multiple interlocking systems while coordinating with her team and communicating with commanders who needed immediate answers about whether the vehicle posed a threat to nearby friendly forces. What set Sarah apart from other EOD specialists wasn't just her technical knowledge, it was her ability to think like the enemy. While other technicians focused on the mechanical aspects of bomb disposal, Sarah spent time studying the psychology of bomb makers understanding their motivations, their training, and most importantly, their mistakes. Every improvised explosive device told a story about its creator, and Sarah had learned to read those stories like literature. In this particular case, she recognized the signature of a bomber who valued complexity over effectiveness. The device was designed more to impress other bomb makers than to efficiently kill soldiers. This psychological insight led her to focus on the primary trigger mechanism rather than getting distracted by the elaborate secondary systems that were primarily for show. Working methodically while explosions from other parts of the exercise thundered in the distance, Sarah disabled each system in sequence. Her training had taught her the technical skills, but months of operational preparation had taught her something equally important: how to manage fear and uncertainty while maintaining the precise focus that explosive ordnance disposal demanded. Santos watched from a safe distance, providing security while Sarah worked. Later, he would tell colleagues that watching her operate was like observing a master craftsman at work. Every movement deliberate, every decision based on solid analysis, rather than guesswork or bravado. When she finally declared the device safe, Santos knew that his unit had acquired something rare, a specialist who combined technical excellence with operational instincts. The successful completion of the exercise marked a turning point in Sarah's military career. She had proven herself not just in the controlled environment of EOD school, but in realistic operational conditions that closely approximated what she would face during actual combat deployment. Her teammates began seeking her advice on technical problems, and her superiors started including her in planning sessions where her insights about enemy tactics could inform broader operational decisions. But Sarah knew that training exercises, no matter how realistic, were still fundamentally different from actual combat. The enemy in Afghanistan wouldn't be following exercise protocols or safety regulations. The bombs would be real, the casualties would be permanent, and the pressure would be unlike anything she had experienced before. As her unit prepared for deployment, Sarah spent her final weeks in the United States studying intelligence reports from Afghanistan, learning about the specific tactics and techniques employed by Taliban bomb makers in the regions where she would soon be operating. Afghanistan in 2005 was a country caught between traditional culture and modern warfare, where ancient tribal disputes intersected with 21st century military technology in ways that created unique challenges for coalition forces. Sarah's unit deployed to Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province, a strategically important area southeast of Kabul, where Taliban forces had established a strong presence, and improvised explosive devices had become their primary weapon. Against NATO troops, the base itself was a study in military pragmatism: concrete barriers, razor wire, and prefabricated buildings surrounded by mountains that offered both protection and concealment for enemy forces. Sarah's living quarters were a converted shipping container she shared with another female soldier, insulated against both the extreme heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter that characterized Afghanistan's harsh climate. Her first call-out came during her third week in country. A patrol from the 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, had discovered a suspected IED along Highway 1, the main supply route connecting Kabul to the southern provinces. The device appeared to be buried in the roadway, marked only by suspicious-looking dirt, and what might have been command wires leading to a nearby compound. Riding in the back of an armored vehicle with her EOD kit and protective suit, Sarah felt the familiar combination of excitement and terror that preceded every mission. This wasn't training. The bomb was real, the enemy was real, and any mistake would result in consequences that couldn't be undone with academic remediation or additional instruction. The patrol that had discovered the device had established a security perimeter and evacuated local civilians from the immediate area. But Sarah could see faces watching from distant windows and doorways. Some were curious children who had never seen a female soldier. Others were adult men whose expressions suggested they might know more about the suspicious device than they were willing to admit. Chief Santos briefed Sarah on the tactical situation. While she prepared her equipment, intelligence suggested that the device was probably pressure-activated, designed to detonate when a heavy vehicle passed over it. The command wires might be decoys, or they might indicate remote detonation capability. Local informants had provided contradictory information about whether Taliban fighters were still in the area, and overhead surveillance had identified several possible escape routes that enemy forces might use if they decided to attack during the disposal operation. Approaching the suspected device in her protective suit, Sarah found herself drawing on every aspect of her training while simultaneously confronting the reality that this situation was unlike anything she had practiced. The bomb maker who had constructed this device wasn't following textbook procedures or exercise protocols. They were trying to kill her specifically, and they had designed their weapon with intimate knowledge of how EOD specialists typically operated. The device itself was more sophisticated than intelligence reports had suggested. Rather than a simple pressure plate, Sarah discovered a complex triggering mechanism that incorporated multiple activation methods. There was indeed a pressure-sensitive component, but also magnetic sensors that could detect the metal content of passing vehicles, and what appeared to be a timer mechanism that might cause detonation after a predetermined period regardless of other factors. Working in the Afghan heat while wearing full protective gear, Sarah began the delicate process of understanding the bomber's logic. This wasn't random violence, it was carefully planned warfare designed to maximize psychological impact as well as physical damage. The bomber had anticipated that coalition forces would discover the device and had incorporated anti-handling measures specifically intended to kill disposal specialists. But as Sarah studied the construction more carefully, she began to recognize patterns that reminded her of devices she had analyzed during training. The bomber was skilled but not innovative, using techniques that had been documented in intelligence reports from other provinces. More importantly, they had made subtle mistakes that revealed both their training background and their operational limitations. The primary trigger mechanism was hidden beneath what appeared to be ordinary road debris, but the electrical connections showed evidence of hasty assembly under less than ideal conditions. Sarah could see where insulation had been stripped imprecisely, where solder joints had been made with inadequate equipment, and where the bomber had been forced to improvise solutions to engineering problems they hadn't fully anticipated. These small imperfections became the key to understanding how the device could be safely disabled. Working methodically while maintaining radio contact with Chief Santos, Sarah began isolating different systems within the bomb. Each decision was made with deliberate care, but without the paralysis that could prove fatal when working under combat conditions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most dangerous moment came when Sarah realized that the device incorporated a secondary trigger designed specifically to kill disposal technicians. If the primary system were disabled incorrectly, a backup mechanism would automatically initiate detonation. This wasn't just a bomb, it was a trap within a trap, designed by someone who understood exactly how coalition EOD specialists had been trained to approach such problems. But Sarah's training had prepared her for exactly this kind of psychological warfare. Rather than rushing to defeat the obvious threat, she spent precious additional minutes studying the bomber's complete design philosophy. Every bomb maker had a signature, a particular way of solving engineering problems and implementing their destructive vision. Sarah had learned to recognize these signatures, and in this case, she identified techniques that had been used in several previous devices her unit had encountered. This pattern recognition allowed her to anticipate where the bomber had placed their anti-handling devices and how they had configured the backup systems. Working with surgical precision, Sarah disabled each component in the specific sequence required to prevent the secondary triggers from activating. When the device finally went silent, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with the sobering recognition that this was just the first of many such encounters she would face during her deployment. Over the following months, Sarah established herself as one of the most effective EOD specialists in her area of operations. Her success rate was remarkable. She had successfully disabled 47 improvised, explosive devices without a single failure or injury to herself or her team members. But more than technical competence, Sarah had developed something that set her apart from other specialists, an almost intuitive understanding of how Taliban bomb makers thought and operated. Her reputation began to spread beyond her immediate unit. Other EOD teams started requesting her assistance with particularly complex devices, and intelligence analysts sought her input when trying to understand patterns in enemy bombing campaigns. Sarah found herself briefing senior officers about bomber psychology and tactics, contributing to the broader coalition understanding of how improvised explosive devices were being employed as weapons of asymmetric warfare. The breakthrough that would define her legacy came during a routine patrol in November 2005. Sarah's team was providing EOD support for a joint operation involving Afghan National Army forces and a company from the 10th Mountain Division. The mission was straightforward: clear a valley road that had been repeatedly attacked with IEDs, making it impossible for humanitarian supplies to reach isolated villages that had been cut off for weeks. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces had placed multiple devices along the route, part of a coordinated campaign to demonstrate their ability to control access to areas that coalition forces claimed to have secured. The political implications were significant. If the road couldn't be reopened, it would be seen as a victory for Taliban propaganda and a demonstration that NATO forces couldn't protect Afghan civilians who had allied themselves with the coalition government. The operation began before dawn, with Sarah's team traveling in the middle of a convoy that included engineers, infantry, and medical personnel. The road itself was a dirt track that wound through mountainous terrain, with numerous locations where bombs could be concealed and few options for alternative routes. If the primary path was blocked, the first device was discovered around mid-morning, buried beneath what appeared to be a recent landslide. Sarah's initial assessment suggested a relatively straightforward pressure-activated bomb, but as she began her approach, something felt wrong. The placement was too obvious, the concealment too crude for the sophisticated bomb makers who had been operating in this area. Working more cautiously than usual, Sarah discovered that the obvious device was indeed a decoy, designed to draw EOD specialists into a kill zone where the real bomb was hidden. This was a level of tactical sophistication that hadn't been seen before in this area of operations, suggesting that Taliban forces had brought in more experienced bomb makers or had received additional training from outside sources. The actual device was hidden 30 meters away from the decoy, positioned where an EOD specialist would typically establish their equipment staging area while working on the primary bomb. It was designed not just to kill the disposal technician, but to take out their entire support team and any infantry, providing security during the disposal operation. Sarah's recognition of this trap prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of coalition forces, but it also revealed something disturbing about the evolving nature of the enemy they were facing. This wasn't random violence or desperate improvisation. It was sophisticated military engineering designed by people who understood exactly how coalition forces operated and how to exploit their standard procedures. As word of Sarah's success spread through military channels, she began receiving requests to participate in operations far beyond her unit's normal area of responsibility. Special operations forces sought her expertise for sensitive missions, where bomb disposal required not just technical skill, but tactical insight into enemy thinking. Intelligence agencies wanted her analysis of bombing patterns to help predict where future attacks might occur, but Sarah's most significant challenge was yet to come. In December 2005, coalition intelligence intercepted communications suggesting that Taliban forces were planning a spectacular attack designed to cause massive casualties and demonstrate their continued relevance despite months of coalition military pressure. The target appeared to be a celebration planned for New Year's Day in Kabul, where thousands of Afghan civilians and hundreds of coalition personnel would gather in a symbolic demonstration of Afghanistan's democratic progress. The intelligence was fragmentary and contradictory, but it suggested that Taliban bomb makers had been working for months on a device unlike anything previously encountered in Afghanistan. References in the intercepted communications mentioned the mother of all bombs and suggested that the attack would be visible from space when it occurred. Sarah found herself assigned to a joint task force responsible for identifying and neutralizing this threat. The team included specialists from multiple countries, intelligence analysts, and Afghan security personnel who understood local conditions better than any coalition forces could. But the technical aspects of the mission, understanding how such a massive explosive device might be constructed and deployed, fell primarily to Sarah and a handful of other EOD specialists. Working around the clock, the task force began analyzing every piece of available intelligence about Taliban bomb-making capabilities. They studied procurement patterns for explosive materials, monitored communications for technical discussions, and interviewed captured Taliban fighters who might have knowledge of the planned attack. What emerged was a picture of a plot that was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone had initially realized. The Taliban hadn't just planned a single large bomb, they had developed a coordinated campaign involving multiple devices, designed to create cascading destruction that would overwhelm emergency responders and maximize both physical and psychological impact. Sarah's expertise in bomber psychology became crucial as the task force tried to anticipate where and how the attack would be carried out. Understanding the enemy's mindset was just as important as understanding their technical capabilities, and Sarah's months of operational experience had given her insights that couldn't be gained through academic study or intelligence analysis alone. As New Year's Day approached, the pressure on Sarah and her colleagues intensified. They knew that somewhere in Kabul, a massive explosive device was waiting to be detonated, but despite weeks of investigation, they still hadn't identified its location or the specific method that would be used to trigger it. December 30th, 2005, Sarah Chen sat in a secure briefing room at Bagram Air Base, surrounded by intelligence officers, special operations personnel, and senior military commanders whose collective experience spanned decades of counter-terrorism operations. The atmosphere was tense with the knowledge that somewhere in Kabul, a massive explosive device was waiting to detonate during the next day's New Year celebration. But despite weeks of intensive investigation, they still hadn't located the bomb or identified the specific target. The briefing materials spread across the conference table painted a sobering picture of Taliban capabilities that had evolved far beyond what coalition intelligence had previously understood. Intercepted communications suggested that bomb makers trained in Pakistan had spent months in Afghanistan, not just building a single device, but establishing a sophisticated network of explosive specialists capable of coordinated attacks across multiple locations. "What we're dealing with," explained Major Patricia Williams, the intelligence officer leading the briefing, "isn't just a large bomb. It's a complex system designed to maximize casualties through a carefully orchestrated sequence of explosions. Initial reports suggest the primary device contains enough explosive material to level a city block. But that's just the beginning." Sarah studied the technical diagrams that had been reconstructed from fragmentary intelligence. The device appeared to incorporate multiple stages of detonation, each designed to achieve specific tactical objectives. The first explosion would destroy the immediate target and draw emergency responders to the scene. Secondary devices would then detonate as rescue workers arrived, maximizing casualties among police, military, and medical personnel. Additional explosives positioned along likely evacuation routes would ensure that fleeing civilians couldn't escape the kill zone. This represents a fundamental shift in Taliban tactics, continued Major Williams. Previous attacks focused on military targets or symbolic political objectives. This operation is designed for mass civilian casualties and maximum psychological impact. They want to demonstrate that the coalition can't protect Afghan civilians, even in the heart of the capital. Sarah absorbed the technical details while simultaneously analyzing the psychological profile of the bombers they were hunting. The complexity of the planned attack suggested coordination between multiple specialists, each contributing different expertise to create something unprecedented in Afghanistan's conflict. But complexity also created vulnerabilities. The more sophisticated a plan became, the more opportunities it provided for detection and disruption. "Ma'am," Sarah interjected during a pause in the briefing, "the communications intercepts mention specific timing references that might help us narrow down the target location. The bombers keep referring to the moment of greatest celebration, and when the eyes of the world are watching, that suggests they're not just planning random destruction. They want maximum media coverage." Colonel James Mitchell, the task force commander, leaned forward with interest. "What are you thinking, Specialist Chen?" "Sir, if they want international attention, they need to attack something that will be broadcast live or photographed by international media. The New Year's celebration has several planned events, but only a few will have significant media presence." Sarah pulled out a map of Kabul and began marking locations. "The main celebration is planned for Masood Circle, with Afghan government officials and coalition representatives. But there's also a smaller event at the American Embassy compound and a cultural celebration at the National Museum." "The embassy is too heavily fortified," observed Captain Rodriguez from the CIA contingent. "They'd need specialized equipment to breach those defenses, and intelligence suggests they're using improvised materials rather than military-grade explosives." Sarah nodded, then pointed to another location on the map. "What about the new children's hospital? It's scheduled to be officially opened tomorrow as part of the New Year celebrations. Maximum symbolic value, destroying hope for Afghanistan's future while killing the most innocent victims possible. And the security would be lighter than military or government targets." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The new pediatric hospital represented one of the coalition's most significant humanitarian achievements in Afghanistan. Its destruction would not only cause massive casualties among children and medical staff, but would also demonstrate Taliban ability to strike at the heart of reconstruction efforts that were supposed to prove Afghanistan was moving toward a better future. Intelligence reports indicate increased Taliban surveillance around the hospital district over the past 2 weeks. Major Williams confirmed, checking her notes. "We dismissed it as routine reconnaissance, but if they're planning a major attack, we need to evacuate immediately," Colonel Mitchell began, but Sarah interrupted him. "Sir, with respect, evacuation might not be possible. If the bomb is as large as intelligence suggests, and if it's designed with secondary devices to target evacuation routes, moving people could make the situation worse. We need to find and disable the device before it can detonate." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity as the task force shifted from intelligence gathering to direct action. Sarah found herself at the center of planning for what would become one of the most complex bomb disposal operations ever attempted in Afghanistan. The suspected device wasn't just large, it was potentially surrounded by backup systems, anti-handling measures, and secondary explosive devices designed to kill anyone who tried to disarm it. But as Sarah studied the available intelligence more carefully, she began to see patterns that reminded her of the bombers she had encountered during previous operations. Despite their increased sophistication, the Taliban specialists were still making some of the same fundamental mistakes that had allowed her to defeat their earlier devices. They were engineers and ideologists, not professional soldiers, and their approach to bomb making reflected both their strengths and their limitations. "The key," she explained to Colonel Mitchell as they flew toward Kabul in a Black Hawk helicopter, "is understanding that they're trying to impress each other as much as they're trying to kill us. This device is probably more complex than it needs to be, which means there are more ways to disable it if we can understand the builder's psychology." The Children's Hospital in Kabul was a symbol of international cooperation and hope for Afghanistan's future. Built with funding from multiple coalition countries and designed to provide medical care for the youngest victims of decades of warfare, it represented everything the Taliban opposed about foreign influence in Afghanistan. As Sarah's team approached the building in the early hours of December 31st, she could see why it would appeal to bombers seeking maximum symbolic and psychological impact. The hospital itself was a modern 3-story structure, surrounded by gardens and playground equipment, designed to be as welcoming and non-threatening as possible for child patients and their families. But intelligence analysis had revealed disturbing details about Taliban surveillance of the facility. Over the previous month, unknown individuals had been observed photographing the building from multiple angles, timing the movements of security personnel, and apparently studying the building's structural vulnerabilities. Sarah's bomb disposal team worked in coordination with Special Operations Forces, who had surrounded the hospital district and evacuated civilians from a 6-block radius. But time was running short. The official opening ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 8 hours, and if the explosive device was timer-activated rather than remote-controlled, they might have even less time to locate and disable it. The search began with electronic detection equipment designed to identify the electromagnetic signatures of explosive devices. Sarah and her team moved methodically through the hospital building, checking every room, every closet, every possible location where a large bomb might be concealed. The building's modern construction actually made their job more difficult. Extensive electrical systems and medical equipment created background interference that could mask the presence of explosive devices. It was Chief Santos who made the first significant discovery. While checking the hospital's basement maintenance areas, he found evidence of recent unauthorized entry tool marks on locked doors, disturbed dust patterns, and most ominously, traces of explosive residue that suggested someone had been handling military ordnance in the building's lower levels. "Chun, you need to see this," Santos called over the radio. Sarah made her way to the basement, where Santos had discovered what appeared to be a hastily concealed access panel leading to the building's electrical and plumbing infrastructure. The panel had been opened recently, and the space beyond showed signs of significant modification. Using fiber optic cameras, Sarah began exploring the hidden compartment. What she found was far worse than intelligence estimates had suggested. The Taliban bomb makers hadn't just planted a single large device. They had essentially turned the hospital's entire infrastructure into a massive explosive system. Shaped charges had been placed at critical structural points throughout the building's foundation, connected by a network of wires and timing devices that would ensure coordinated detonation. But the true horror of the discovery became apparent as Sarah traced the electrical connections further into the building's infrastructure. The bombers hadn't just targeted the hospital itself, they had incorporated the building's medical gas systems, electrical distribution, and even the emergency power generators into their explosive network. When detonated, the device wouldn't just destroy the building through conventional explosives, but would also create secondary explosions involving oxygen tanks, electrical systems, and fuel storage that would ensure no one inside could survive. "This isn't just terrorism," Sarah reported to Colonel Mitchell over the radio. "This is engineering genocide. They've designed it to kill every person in the building, including anyone who might survive the initial explosion in protected areas or bomb shelters. The complexity of the device created both opportunities and challenges for disposal. On one hand, the intricate network of connections meant that disabling key components might prevent the entire system from functioning. On the other hand, the bombers had clearly anticipated that coalition forces might attempt to disarm their creation, and they had incorporated multiple backup systems and anti-handling devices designed to ensure detonation even if parts of the network were discovered and disabled. Working in the claustrophobic space beneath the hospital, Sarah began the most complex bomb disposal operation of her career. Every wire had to be traced, every component analyzed, and every connection understood before she could begin the actual disarmament process. One mistake, cutting the wrong wire, moving the wrong component, or triggering any of the anti-handling devices would detonate the entire system and destroy not just the hospital, but several surrounding city blocks. The pressure was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. This wasn't just about saving her own life or the lives of her immediate team. Thousands of Afghan civilians lived and worked in the surrounding area, and the New Year's celebration would bring even more people into the potential blast zone. The political implications were equally staggering. The destruction of the children's hospital would be seen as a catastrophic failure of coalition security and would likely undermine international support for continued operations in Afghanistan. But as Sarah worked through the technical challenges, she began to recognize the psychological signature of the bomber who had designed this system. Despite its deadly efficiency, the device showed the same fundamental characteristics she had observed in previous Taliban explosive devices: combination of technical sophistication and operational overconfidence that created exploitable vulnerabilities. Bomber was clearly skilled and had access to advanced materials and training, but they had made the same mistake that plagued many technically minded individuals. They had assumed that complexity automatically meant effectiveness. The elaborate network of connections and backup systems was impressive from an engineering perspective, but it also created multiple points of failure that a knowledgeable disposal specialist could exploit. Working methodically despite the time pressure, Sarah began identifying which components were essential to the device's function and which were primarily psychological, designed to intimidate and confuse disposal specialists rather than contribute to the actual explosive effect. This analysis allowed her to focus her attention on the critical systems while ignoring the elaborate decoys and redundancies that the bomber had incorporated to protect their creation. As Sarah worked deeper into the explosive network hidden beneath the children's hospital, she discovered that the Taliban bomb makers had created something far more sinister than a simple, large-scale explosive device. They had essentially weaponized the building's entire infrastructure, turning every system that was meant to heal and protect into a mechanism of mass destruction. The medical gas distribution system, designed to deliver life-saving oxygen to young patients, had been rigged with additional connections that would cause explosive ruptures throughout the building during detonation. The electrical system had been modified with capacitors and amplifiers that would create devastating electrical fires even in areas not directly affected by the primary explosions. Most chillingly, the building's fire suppression system had been sabotaged to ensure that any automated emergency responses would actually accelerate the destruction rather than contain it. But Sarah's months of operational experience had taught her to read the psychology behind such elaborate preparations. The bomber who had designed this system was technically proficient, but emotionally driven by a need to demonstrate superiority over coalition forces. Every redundant system, every backup trigger, every anti-handling device was as much about psychological warfare as practical effectiveness. This insight became the key to understanding how the device could be defeated. Rather than trying to disable every component of the complex network, Sarah began focusing on the bomber's ego, identifying which elements of the system were most important to the creator's sense of accomplishment and technical pride. The primary timing mechanism was hidden behind multiple layers of protection, but Sarah recognized that its location and configuration reflected the bomber's desire to ensure that coalition forces would understand the sophistication of what they were facing. Even in failure, the bomber wanted credit for their technical achievement, and this vanity created the vulnerability that Sarah needed to exploit. Working with surgical precision in the confined space beneath the hospital, Sarah began systematically isolating the bomber's proudest achievements from the more practical components of the explosive network. Each cut wire and disabled component had to be executed with perfect accuracy. There would be no opportunity for trial and error, no chance to learn from mistakes. Chief Santos provided security and communication support from the hospital's main level, coordinating with the Special Operations Forces who had established a perimeter around the building. But Sarah was essentially working alone in the darkness, guided only by her flashlight and her understanding of the twisted logic that had created this underground maze of destructive potential. The most dangerous moment came when Sarah realized that the bomber had incorporated a dead man's switch into the timing mechanism. If the primary system detected that key components had been disabled, it would automatically trigger immediate detonation through a backup network that Sarah hadn't yet fully mapped. This meant that she couldn't simply disable the obvious threats. She had to understand the entire system well enough to defeat all of its safeguards simultaneously. Time was running critically short. The New Year's celebration was scheduled to begin in less than 3 hours, and even if the official ceremony were delayed or canceled, thousands of people remained in the surrounding neighborhoods, unaware of the massive explosive device hidden beneath what they believed was a symbol of hope and healing. Sarah's training had prepared her for technical challenges, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological pressure of knowing that her decisions over the next few minutes would determine whether thousands of innocent people lived or died. The weight of that responsibility was almost paralyzing, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the technical problems rather than their human implications. Working with methodical precision that belied her racing heart, Sarah began the final phase of the disarmament operation. She had identified the sequence of actions required to defeat the bomber's safeguards, but executing that sequence would require split-second timing and absolute confidence in her analysis of the device's logic. The dead man switch was connected to the primary timer through a series of relays that monitored the electrical continuity of key components throughout the explosive network. Sarah's plan required her to simultaneously disable multiple monitoring circuits while rerouting electrical current through bypass connections she had installed during the previous hour of preparation. If her analysis was correct, the bomber's elaborate safeguards would be neutralized and the entire explosive network would become inert. If she had misunderstood any aspect of the system's logic, the device would detonate immediately, killing not just Sarah and her team, but potentially tens of thousands of civilians in the surrounding area. With steady hands that betrayed none of the terror she felt internally, Sarah began executing her plan. The first cut disabled the primary timing circuit, but as expected, backup systems immediately began engaging to continue the countdown toward detonation. The second and third cuts isolated key monitoring systems, causing alarm indicators to flash throughout the underground network, but not yet triggering the dead man switch. The critical moment came with the fourth cut. Sarah's analysis suggested that this would complete the isolation of the dead man switch from the primary explosive network, but the bomber had been clever enough to incorporate multiple layers of deception into their design. If Sarah had misread any aspect of the system's configuration, this would be the moment when her mistake would become fatally apparent. The wire parted cleanly under her cutters, and for a terrifying moment, nothing happened. No alarms, no automatic sequences, no immediate indication of whether her plan had succeeded or failed. Sarah held her breath, waiting for either the all-clear signal from her monitoring equipment or the flash of light that would be the last thing she ever saw. Then, gradually, the monitoring systems throughout the network began showing safe readings. One by one, the electrical circuits that had been poised to trigger mass destruction went dark. The elaborate network of explosives remained physically present throughout the hospital's infrastructure, but the systems that would have coordinated their detonation had been permanently disabled. The silence that followed Sarah's final cut was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of the electrical hum and mechanical vibration that had filled the basement as the bombs' timing mechanisms counted down toward detonation. For several long seconds, Sarah remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe as she waited for confirmation that the explosive network had been truly neutralized. Her monitoring equipment gradually confirmed what her instincts had told her. The dead man switch had been defeated, the primary timing mechanisms had been disabled, and the elaborate network of secondary and tertiary explosive devices throughout the hospital's infrastructure had been rendered inert. The bomb that could have killed 50,000 people and destroyed Afghanistan's most important symbol of hope for the future was finally safe. "Santos," Sarah called into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was making her hands shake now that the immediate danger had passed. "The device is neutralized. All primary and backup systems are showing safe. We need EOD teams to begin clearing the physical explosives, but the timing and triggering mechanisms are permanently disabled." The response from the surface was immediate and emotional. Chief Santos, who had maintained professional calm throughout the operation, couldn't hide the relief in his voice as he confirmed Sarah's report to the command structure. Within minutes, the hospital was filled with additional EAD specialists, explosive detection teams, and engineers who would spend the next several days carefully removing the physical components of the bomb network that had been hidden throughout the building's infrastructure. But Sarah's work wasn't finished. As the immediate crisis passed, she found herself at the center of an investigation designed to understand how Taliban forces had acquired the technical knowledge and physical materials necessary to create such a sophisticated weapon. The implications extended far beyond this single attack. If the enemy had developed these capabilities, similar threats might exist at other high-value targets throughout Afghanistan. Working with intelligence analysts and forensic specialists, Sarah began the painstaking process of documenting every aspect of the defeated bomb network. Each component told part of the story about how the device had been planned, constructed, and deployed. The explosive materials themselves were consistent with previous Taliban attacks, but the electronic components showed evidence of more advanced manufacturing and design capabilities than coalition forces had previously encountered. This represents a significant escalation in enemy technical capabilities, Sarah reported during a debriefing session with senior military commanders. The bomber who designed this system had access to advanced training, sophisticated materials, and probably outside technical support. This wasn't improvised by local Taliban forces. It required coordination with specialists who had formal engineering education and experience with complex electrical systems. The broader implications were sobering. If Taliban forces had acquired this level of technical sophistication, traditional counter-terrorism approaches would need to be fundamentally reconsidered. The enemy was no longer limited to simple improvised explosive devices and small-scale attacks. They had demonstrated the capability to plan and execute operations that could cause casualties comparable to major conventional military engagements. Sarah's success in defeating the hospital bomb marked a turning point not just in her own military career, but in coalition understanding of the evolving nature of the threat they faced in Afghanistan. Her technical expertise had saved thousands of lives, but perhaps more importantly, her psychological insight into bomber motivations had provided intelligence analysts with new approaches for anticipating and preventing similar attacks. The recognition That followed was both overwhelming and humbling. Sarah received the Bronze Star Medal for her actions, but she was more proud of the fact that the Children's Hospital opened as scheduled, becoming a symbol of resilience and hope rather than destruction and despair. The first patients were admitted. On January 2, 2006, children whose lives had been saved not just by the medical care they would receive, but by Sarah's actions in the basement 2 days earlier. But for Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Several weeks after the incident, she received a letter from Dr. Amina Karimi, the Afghan pediatrician who had been selected as the hospital's first chief of staff. The letter was brief but profound. "Lieutenant Chen, you saved not just the building, but the hope it represents. The children who will be healed here will grow up in a world where they know that someone cared enough to risk everything to protect their future." Sarah's deployment in Afghanistan continued for several more months, during which she successfully disposed of dozens of additional explosive devices and trained Afghan security forces in bomb disposal techniques that would serve them long after coalition forces departed. But the hospital incident remained the defining moment of her military career, the proof that technical competence, psychological insight, and moral courage could triumph over the most sophisticated instruments of terror and destruction. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her time in Afghanistan, she would always mention the Children's Hospital, not because of the recognition she received or the technical challenge she had overcome, but because of what the incident represented about the fundamental purpose of military service. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won on traditional battlefields, but in basement workshops where the stakes were measured not in strategic objectives or tactical advantages, but in the simple human terms of lives saved and hope preserved. The little girl from Ohio who had learned about circuits and patience from her immigrant father had become the soldier who proved that technical expertise, when guided by moral purpose and tempered by hard-won experience, could indeed change the world. Sarah Chen had been called too emotional for combat, but it was precisely her emotional intelligence, her ability to understand and anticipate human behavior under extreme pressure, that had made her capable of saving 50,000 lives. With a pair of wire cutters and the courage to use them when everything depended on getting it right the first time. The aftermath of the Children's Hospital incident reverberated through military and intelligence circles far beyond Afghanistan. Sarah Chen found herself at the center of a fundamental reassessment of how coalition forces understood and responded to evolving terrorist tactics. Her success hadn't just prevented a catastrophic attack, it had revealed capabilities and methodologies that intelligence agencies hadn't previously recognized in Taliban operations. Within weeks of the hospital incident, Sarah was recalled to the United States for debriefings that involved not just military personnel, but representatives from the CIA, FBI, and international intelligence agencies. The technical details of the bomb network she had defeated were studied and analyzed by experts who specialized in understanding how terrorist organizations acquired and disseminated advanced tactical knowledge. "What you encountered in Kabul," explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a counterterrorism analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency, represents a new phase in asymmetric warfare. The technical sophistication of that device required coordination between multiple specialists, access to advanced materials, and most importantly, detailed knowledge of how our EOD specialists are trained to respond to such threats. The implications were profound and disturbing. If Taliban forces had acquired this level of capability, similar threats might exist at high-value targets throughout the Middle East and beyond. Sarah's success had prevented one catastrophic attack, but it had also revealed that the enemy possessed capabilities that could be replicated elsewhere. But Sarah's contribution to understanding these new threats went beyond her technical expertise. In disarming the hospital bomb, her psychological analysis of the bomber's motivations and methods provided intelligence analysts with new frameworks for predicting and preventing similar attacks. The insight that bomber ego and the desire for recognition created exploitable vulnerabilities became a key component of updated counterterrorism strategies. The bomber wanted us to understand how clever they were, Sarah explained during one of her debriefing sessions. They included complexity that wasn't necessary for the device's function, but was essential for their psychological satisfaction. Understanding that vanity, that need for recognition and technical validation, became the key to defeating their safeguards. This psychological dimension of bomb disposal had been largely overlooked in previous training programs, which focused primarily on technical knowledge and manual dexterity. Sarah's success demonstrated that understanding the human element, the personality and motivations of the bomb maker, could be just as important as understanding the mechanical components of their devices. As a result of these insights, Sarah found herself assigned to a new role that combined operational experience with analytical expertise. She became part of a joint task force responsible for developing updated training programs for EOD specialists, incorporating psychological profiling techniques alongside traditional technical instruction. The work was intellectually challenging but emotionally difficult. Sarah spent months analyzing failed disposal attempts, studying the psychological signatures of successful bomb makers, and developing training scenarios that would prepare future EOD specialists for the kind of sophisticated threats she had encountered in Afghanistan. But perhaps the most important aspect of her new role was mentoring the next generation of bomb disposal specialists, particularly women who were fighting the same battles for acceptance and opportunity that Sarah had faced years earlier. The military was slowly beginning to recognize that diversity of perspective and experience could be a tactical advantage rather than a liability. But progress remained frustratingly slow. Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez was one of the first female candidates Sarah worked with during her new assignment. Rodriguez had faced many of the same arguments about emotional unsuitability that had nearly derailed Sarah's own career, but she possessed the same combination of technical aptitude and psychological insight that made for exceptional EOD specialists. "They're going to tell you that you're too emotional, too fragile, too unpredictable for this work," Sarah told Rodriguez during one of their training sessions. "What they don't understand is that emotional intelligence, the ability to read people, understand motivations, and maintain empathy under pressure, isn't a weakness. It's a weapon." Sarah's training programs began producing EOD specialists who approached bomb disposal differently than previous generations. They were technically competent, but they also understood that every explosive device told a story about its creator. They learned to read those stories, to understand the psychology behind different bombing techniques, and to exploit the human vulnerabilities that even the most sophisticated bomb makers couldn't eliminate from their work. The success of these new approaches was measured not just in successful disposal operations, but in the broader intelligence value that EOD specialists began providing to counter-terrorism efforts. When bomb disposal technicians understood the psychological profiles of the bomb makers they were defeating, they could provide insights that helped predict future attacks and identify new threats before they fully materialized. Sarah's work during this period established her as one of the military's leading experts on the intersection of technical skills and psychological analysis in bomb disposal operations. She published papers on bomber psychology that became required reading in EOD training programs, and she consulted with international allies who were facing similar evolving threats in their own theaters of operation. But despite her growing reputation and professional success, Sarah remained haunted by the knowledge that the threat she had defeated in Afghanistan was just one example of capabilities that terrorist organizations were continuing to develop and refine. The children's hospital incident had been prevented, but it had also served as a proof of concept that demonstrated what was possible when Sophisticated engineering was applied to terrorist objectives. Intelligence reports continued to indicate that similar capabilities were being developed by terrorist organizations in other regions, and Sarah found herself increasingly involved in efforts to identify and neutralize these threats before they could be fully implemented. Her expertise was in demand not just for training programs, but for active operations where her psychological insights could help anticipate and defeat new types of explosive devices. The irony wasn't lost on her that the emotional intelligence she had been told would disqualify her from bomb disposal work had become her most valuable professional asset. Her ability to understand and predict human behavior under extreme pressure had made her one of the military's most effective specialists in a field that required not just technical knowledge, but deep insight into the darkest aspects of human motivation and capability. 5 years after the Children's Hospital incident, Sarah Chen had become a legend within the explosive ordnance disposal community. Her techniques for psychological profiling of bomb makers were being taught in military academies around the world, and her success rate in both training and operational environments remained unmatched. But Sarah's most significant challenge was yet to come, one that would test not just her technical expertise, but her ability to confront the long-term consequences of the evolving terrorist threats she had been fighting for years. The call came. On a Tuesday morning in March 2010, Sarah was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, conducting advanced training for a new class of EOD specialists when her secure phone rang with a priority message from the Pentagon. The voice on the other end belonged to General Patricia Hayes, who had become Sarah's primary contact for special operations, requiring her unique combination of technical and analytical skills. "Chun, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," General Hayes said without preamble. "Intelligence indicates that the bombing techniques you defeated in Afghanistan have been adapted and are being implemented by terrorist cells in multiple locations. We need you in Washington immediately for a briefing that involves national security implications beyond anything you've encountered before." The briefing that followed was both sobering and terrifying. Over the previous 18 months, intelligence agencies had identified at least 7 different terrorist organizations that had acquired and adapted the sophisticated bombing techniques that Sarah had first encountered at the Kabul Children's Hospital. The methods had been refined, the technology had been improved, and most ominously, the target selection had expanded to include civilian infrastructure in the United States and allied countries. "The bomber whose methods you defeated in Afghanistan," explained CIA analyst Dr. James Park, wasn't working alone. He was part of a network that has been sharing technical knowledge across organizational and national boundaries. What you encountered was essentially a field test of techniques that were always intended for broader implementation. The intelligence briefing included photographs and technical diagrams that made Sarah's blood run cold. The bombing techniques she had studied and defeated were being adapted for attacks on subway systems, hospitals, schools, and other civilian targets where maximum casualties could be achieved with minimal risk of detection before detonation. But the most disturbing revelation was that the psychological profiling techniques Sarah had developed to understand and defeat these bombing methods were also being studied by the enemy. Terrorist organizations had apparently analyzed her successful interventions and were adapting their methods to account for the psychological vulnerabilities she had exploited. "They're learning from your successes," General Hayes explained. "The bomber psychology you used to defeat their devices is being countered with new approaches designed to eliminate the ego-driven vulnerabilities that you identified. We're essentially in an arms race where both sides are adapting their methods based on previous encounters." Sarah found herself assigned to a classified task force responsible for staying ahead of these evolving threats. Her new role required her to think not just like a bomb disposal specialist, but like the terrorist bomb makers who were studying her methods and developing countermeasures designed to defeat her psychological insights. The work was intellectually fascinating, but emotionally exhausting. Sarah spent months analyzing intelligence reports, studying intercepted communications, and developing new approaches for understanding bomber psychology that went beyond the techniques that had made her famous. She had to anticipate how her own methods would be countered and develop meta-strategies that could succeed even when the enemy understood and had prepared for her psychological approach. But the theoretical nature of this work was shattered when Sarah received intelligence that one of the adapted bombing techniques was being prepared for implementation in a major American city. The target was a children's hospital in Boston. Deliberate echo of Sarah's success in Afghanistan, designed to demonstrate that terrorist organizations could adapt and overcome even her most successful interventions. The bomber responsible for the planned Boston attack had studied Sarah's methods extensively. Intelligence intercepts revealed detailed discussions of her psychological profiling techniques, analysis of her successful interventions, and most disturbingly, specific countermeasures designed to exploit what the bomber saw as weaknesses in her approach. "This isn't just another bomb disposal operation," General Hayes told Sarah as they prepared for deployment to Boston. "This is a direct challenge to you personally. The bomber has designed their device specifically to defeat your methods, and they've incorporated psychological elements designed to manipulate your decision-making process during the disposal operation." The flight to Boston gave Sarah time to study the intelligence files and prepare for what would be the most personal and dangerous confrontation of her career. The bomber she would be facing had made it clear through intercepted communications that they saw this attack as a test of whether American EID techniques could be defeated by someone who understood and had prepared for psychological profiling approaches. But as Sarah reviewed the technical specifications and psychological profiles, she began to see something that the intelligence analysts had missed. The bomber's obsession with defeating her methods had created new vulnerabilities, different from the ego-driven weaknesses she had exploited in previous operations, but equally exploitable if she could understand and adapt to this new type of psychological profile. The bomber wasn't just trying to kill civilians or destroy a symbolic target. They were trying to prove their intellectual superiority over Sarah personally, and that need for validation created opportunities that a sufficiently insightful disposal specialist might be able to exploit. As the plane descended toward Boston, Sarah realized that she was about to face the ultimate test of everything she had learned about the intersection of technical expertise and psychological insight in bomb disposal operations. The success or failure of this mission would determine not just whether hundreds of innocent people lived or died, but whether the techniques she had pioneered could continue to be effective against an enemy that had studied and prepared for them. Boston Children's Hospital on March 15, 2010, was a scene of controlled chaos as federal agents, local police, and military specialists established a security perimeter around one of America's most prestigious pediatric medical facilities. Sarah Chen arrived to find a situation that was both hauntingly familiar and uniquely challenging. Another children's hospital, another sophisticated bomb threat, but this time designed specifically to defeat the methods that had made her famous. Bomber had made their intentions clear through communications intercepted by the NSA. This wasn't just terrorism, it was a personal challenge to Sarah's reputation and techniques. The device hidden somewhere in the hospital had been designed by someone who had studied her successful interventions in detail and believed they could create an explosive system that would defeat even her psychological profiling approaches. The bomber calls himself the engineer. FBI Special Agent Lisa Martinez briefed Sarah as they walked through the evacuated hospital corridors. Intelligence suggests he has advanced degrees in both electrical engineering and psychology, and he's been studying your methods for years. This attack is specifically designed to prove that your psychological profiling techniques can be defeated by someone who understands them. The hospital had been evacuated, But the bomber had made it clear that the device was designed to cause maximum structural damage, even without civilian casualties. The destruction of Boston Children's Hospital would send a message that American counterterrorism capabilities could be defeated by sufficiently determined and intelligent adversaries. But as Sarah began her preliminary assessment of the situation, she realized that the bomber's obsession with defeating her methods had created a different kind of psychological vulnerability. Unlike previous bombers who had been motivated by ideological objectives or personal grievances, this bomber was primarily motivated by intellectual pride and the desire to demonstrate superiority over Sarah personally. He wants to beat me more than he wants to achieve any broader terrorist objective, Sarah explained to Agent Martinez. That changes the psychological dynamics completely. Instead of trying to understand his political motivations or personal trauma, I need to understand his academic ego and professional jealousy. The search for the device began with electronic detection equipment, but Sarah quickly realized that conventional approaches would be insufficient. The bomber had incorporated advanced shielding and decoy electronics designed to confuse standard detection methods. Finding the device would require the same kind of psychological insight that had made Sarah successful in previous operations. Instead of searching randomly, Sarah began analyzing the hospital layout from the perspective of someone trying to make an intellectual statement rather than simply cause destruction. Where would an engineering professor hide a device if their primary goal was to demonstrate technical sophistication rather than maximize casualties? The answer came when Sarah realized that the bomber had left clues throughout the hospital's subtle modifications to electrical systems, carefully placed technical diagrams, and even academic references hidden in graffiti that had appeared overnight. The bomber wanted Sarah to understand the complexity of what they had created, even as she tried to defeat it. Following these intellectual breadcrumbs, Sarah traced the bomber's logic through the hospital's infrastructure to a mechanical room in the basement that housed the building's primary electrical distribution systems. But what she found there was unlike anything she had encountered in her career. The device was less a bomb than a work of art, a sophisticated masterpiece of engineering that incorporated not just explosive elements, but elaborate mechanical systems, electronic displays, and even audio components that would provide commentary on Sarah's disposal attempts. The bomber had created something that was simultaneously deadly and educational, designed to teach Sarah about her own limitations even as she tried to defeat it. This isn't just about killing people or destroying property, Sarah radioed to her support team. This is about proving a point. The bomber has created something that's designed to be as much a lecture as an explosive device. But Sarah's analysis of the bomber's psychology revealed the key to defeating their creation. The elaborate nature of the device, while technically impressive, had created multiple vulnerabilities that a disposal specialist could exploit. The bomber's need to demonstrate their intellectual superiority had led them to incorporate unnecessary complexity that created opportunities for intervention. More importantly, Sarah recognized that the bomber's academic background had led them to approach bomb making like a research project rather than a military operation. They had created something designed to impress peer reviewers rather than efficiently achieve destructive objectives. This academic mindset had introduced systematic weaknesses that Sarah could exploit if she approached the device like a hostile dissertation defense rather than a traditional bomb disposal operation. Working methodically in the basement mechanical room, Sarah began engaging with the bomber's creation on intellectual terms. Instead of simply trying to disable the explosive components, she began analyzing the device's underlying logic, understanding its theoretical framework, and identifying the assumptions that had guided its construction. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that the bomber had made a fundamental error in their psychological assessment of her methods. They had assumed that her success was based on exploiting simple ego-driven vulnerabilities in unsophisticated bomb makers. But Sarah's actual expertise lay in understanding complex human motivations under extreme pressure. Exactly the kind of analysis required to defeat someone whose primary motivation was intellectual validation rather than ideological destruction. The bomber had designed their device to be immune to simple psychological manipulation, but they had made themselves vulnerable to sophisticated psychological analysis. Sarah began working not just on disabling the bomb, but on understanding and exploiting the bomber's own psychological weaknesses. The final phase of the disposal operation required Sarah to essentially outthink someone who had spent years preparing to outthink her. Working with surgical precision while maintaining constant psychological pressure on the bomber's assumptions and vulnerabilities, Sarah began systematically defeating each layer of the device's elaborate defenses. When the device finally went silent, Sarah realized that she had won more than just another successful bomb disposal operation. She had proven that psychological profiling techniques could evolve and adapt to meet new challenges, even when those challenges were specifically designed to defeat them. The aftermath of the Boston incident marked the end of one phase of Sarah's career and the beginning of another. She had demonstrated that the intersection of technical expertise and psychological insight could triumph over even the most sophisticated attempts to defeat it. But more importantly, she had shown that the method she had pioneered could continue to evolve and remain effective against adversaries who understood and had prepared for them. In the years that followed, Sarah continued to develop and refine her approaches to bomb disposal, training new generations of specialists who combined technical knowledge with psychological sophistication. Her success at Boston Children's Hospital became the foundation for advanced training programs that prepared EOD specialists to face adversaries who might have studied and prepared countermeasures for traditional disposal techniques. But for Sarah, the most meaningful outcome of her career wasn't the recognition she received or the technique she developed. It was the simple fact that two children's hospitals, one in Kabul and one in Boston, remained standing as symbols of hope and healing rather than destruction and despair. The little girl from Ohio who had been told she was too emotional for combat had become the woman who proved that emotional intelligence, when combined with technical expertise and moral courage, could indeed save the world. One wire at a time, the critics who had questioned whether women possessed the emotional stability for bomb disposal work had been answered not with arguments or statistics, but with results that spoke for themselves. Sarah Chen had saved 50,000 lives not despite her emotional intelligence, but because of it. Her ability to understand and anticipate human behavior under extreme pressure had made her capable of achievements that pure technical knowledge could never have accomplished alone. As Sarah reflected on her career years later, she often thought about the review board that had nearly prevented her from entering EOD training. The colonel who had worried about one moment of panic, one tear, had fundamentally misunderstood what emotional strength actually meant. True emotional intelligence wasn't about the absence of feeling, it was about the sophisticated management of emotion in service of mission accomplishment and the protection of innocent life. The tears that Sarah had shed in private, after successful operations, when she thought about the children who would grow up safe because of work done in basement mechanical rooms that they would never know existed, those tears weren't a sign of weakness. They were evidence of the emotional connection that made her work meaningful and provided the motivation to continue facing impossible odds. In defense of people who could never thank her for risks they would never know she had taken. Sarah Chen had been called too emotional for combat, but she had proven that emotion properly understood and skillfully applied was the secret weapon that made the difference between technical competence and heroic achievement. In a world where the stakes were measured in human lives and the margin for error was zero, emotional intelligence wasn't a liability to be overcome, but an asset to be cultivated and deployed with the same precision as any other tool in the arsenal of those who stood between civilization and chaos. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.